Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Roseanne for inviting me, to everyone who runs this space for making it possible for us to be here. I don't know how to thank Danny. Thank you, Danny. For it's obviously very hard to follow. So what I've prepared here is really kind of a response, a little bit, to one of the essays in the book that Roseanne mentioned, Wound Building, which is a collection of essays that Danny's written over the past decade or more, that came out last year. Particularly the essay about Porpentine, the essay where Porpentine's work appears, rather, and helps to kind of focus and concentrate the arguments in it. It's the essay called Languages for Fucking Idiots. And that was kind of a prompt for some other stuff I've been thinking. So this is basically just like a few notes of stuff I've been thinking, because I've been sort of giving quite a few lectures and talks in the last few days since I've been in Austria, and so I prepared this morning. Also, and I think it's kind of okay that it's a little bit short and incoherent and struggling, because we have this quite expansive and monumental thing that just happened. So first, there's a few sentences from Adorno on from aesthetic theory, the essay on the categories of the ugly, the beautiful, and technique. And this is just a few sentences I've been thinking about in the last while. So he writes, "What art in the broadest sense works with, it oppresses. This is the ritual of the domination of nature that lives on in play. It is the original sin of art, as well as its permanent protest against morality which revenges cruelty with cruelty. Yet those artworks succeed that rescue over into form something of the amorphous to which they ineluctably do violence. This alone is the reconciling aspect of form. The violence done to the material imitates the violence that issued from the material and that endures in its resistance to form. The subjective domination of the act of forming is not imposed on irrelevant materials, but is read out of them. The cruelty of forming is mimesis of myth with which it struggles." And then the part of Languages for Fucking Idiots essay that I wanted to also think about in these notes is actually towards the end, although there's also many other passages, but the part that I want to mention is where Danny talks about distances as compositional materials, and then I was connecting that to the sort of concept of non-identity, or the category of non-identity. So I've been thinking recently, though very fragmentarily, about violence and form. The different ways that violence registers in or shapes and is thematized by art, from the dispossession of collective culture and branding and authorship to the dispossession of aggression and hurt in the hegemony of concepts of care and the allusion to practices of care in contemporary art. The unavoidability of domination on the one hand and desire to avoid dealing with it on the other. The silencing of protest against domination, which is part of domination, and the silencing of the problem of domination that can define attempts to engage with it, its backgrounding to just being a frame or unavoidable condition in labor process or resource use, for example, in the presentation and mediation of contemporary art. But I've also been thinking about the non-identity of violence, the self-differentiation of violence as abstraction or as practice, as ontology or as government. Walter Benjamin's distinction between law-creating and law-preserving violence, and whether this is purely a political distinction with material or historical consequences, or also a problem of temporality, whether the law-preserving and the law-creating, whether these are tendencies that come to define the situation over time, first going one way, then another. Is art a law-creating or a law-preserving violence? What does it mean that most Western aesthetic philosophy from Kant onwards positions it as the former, that is, creating its own law, following its own law, autonomous? Someone like Dave Beach, for example, takes this outward sociologically, claiming that in the 18th century, the category of the genius applied to whatever artist was able to set up a pattern for others to be inspired by and adapt in their own work. So genius as a diagram or a point of departure, genius as a resource for others. So the genius created rules for others, but was a law unto themselves. And this contrasts quite a bit with our current understanding of the relationship of art to violence, which is not so much as the instigator of violence done to form, as Adorno suggests, but as a witness to, a documenter of, or communicator of violence out there in the world. So, for example, with the idea of forensic aesthetics. This is an idea of the artist as law-preserving, not law-creating, although maybe that's too hasty a distinction. Violence is something done to people in nature which the artist has the duty to document and convey. It is not associated with the transformation or displacement, the degeneration, mutation, the transformation that art imposes on materials, nor the very arrangement of realities into form, or the process and the material. So this is something that was prompted for me in some ways by listening to a talk by Christoph Menke, where following Marx, he talks about critique as not interested in the flushing out of the content behind the form into the open, but rather in understanding why the content has taken the form that it has. Why is value the expression of labor power, not that behind value there is labor power? There's a violence simply through and by virtue of the form, that there is form, or rather the division between form and content on a conceptual or on an instrumental level is itself an index or a genre of violence. But what about that? Is this something that could be preempted by different social relations? As Adorno seems to indicate, at least when it comes to art, he says, quote, "In technique, violence toward nature is not reflected through artistic portrayal, but it is immediately apparent. It could be transformed only by a reorientation of technical forces of production that would direct these forces not only according to desired aims, but equally according to the nature that is to be technically formed. After the abolition of scarcity, the liberation of the forces of production could extend into other dimensions than exclusively that of the quantitative growth of production," end quote. It's not directly said, but there's an implication that the exploitation that marks the teleology of the quantitative is the source and the means of violence. This was recalled for me recently in an essay by an artist who diagnosed in the generation and circulation of cryptocurrency and NFTs the production simultaneously of nothing and the production, of course, of horrendous amounts of waste. So the kind of annihilation or nothingization of the world is part of a quantitative process, a process that she relates to land art and its onstage production of voids in the landscape and the offstage violence of the disappearances that it imposes on what was generated in the process. The world as waste, as infill, and this of course is not just a feature of land art, but you would say of most architecture and building. But the important thing here is total absence of use value, so the production of the nothing. This then connected for me to the thinking I've been doing for a long time about emptiness, voids, and the uncounted as structurally key to capitalist processes of production as much as extraction, or process of production as much as extraction, or exceptions to value as being anchors for value, from unwaged labor to uncommodified nature, which enters the valorization cycle as free inputs and complete waste at the same time. And the other side of that is, of course, the attempts to recognize and valorize that culminate in things like ecosystem services, putting a price on inputs that then are supposedly not so easy to externalize for capital. But I think we can all observe how successful that has been in the thoroughgoing ecological disaster we're living through, which is of course social as much as ecological, since capitalism is the production of nature, just like it's a production of the class relation, not just stuff, obviously. Okay, but where does that leave violence, and the violence intrinsic to autonomy, that which sets its own laws, and of course the opposite of that, autonomy from violence, autonomy as individual or collective self-determination, with art here as a template. Much has been written and said about the problem of the self and self-determination, the relation between the boundaries of the self, the ownership of property, and the effects of racialization as all historically specific and ideologically universalized machines in the head, which preserve violence as the law of civil society. There is also the silencing I mentioned at the beginning, the silencing of the violence not just in aesthetics, not just in experience, but in the general antagonism as well as specific fights, the silencing of political decision and the destructive consequences of critique, a silencing which can be operative, not necessarily which can be operative in the discourse of vulnerability and relationality as sufficient to politics. This comes back for me in the distinction between law-preserving and law-creating violence, and how we can understand that distinction, perhaps as well with reference to maintenance, and unblocking the relation between maintenance and creativity, maintenance and politics, both in the social and aesthetic sense, which is important for many arguments in feminist art and the social reproduction perspective. But where does the violence of oppression and the antagonism to it, but where the violence of oppression and the antagonism to it is not surgically extracted from the benign aureole of ideas around maintenance as exclusively a form of care and preservation, without reference to law, be it the law of the gender distinction and capital accumulation, or the legal aspect of reorganizing our relations differently. And so, concluding with Danny's essay on Corpatine and the loop between fascist and anti-fascist aesthetics, this idea he concludes with of holding spaces open for the differences between us and how we try to sublimate them in language for the violence that cannot be domesticated or formed into domination, into administration and reflection, which is to say the importance of avoiding the collapse of the spaces that allow us to relate to one another, the space that allows for the differences we need to communicate, and the unlivable space posited by self-proprietorship and its expansion and competition. That's just some of what I wanted to think about. Yeah.
Thank you, Marina.
Thank you.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. No?
Bit late. Maybe you could say just something about what Corpatine is.
You should say.
Okay.
Maybe
Because you're working.
That's
You
true.
haven't, there's an essay in the book.
Yeah, right. So Corpatine Charity Heartscape is a US West Coast computer game designer and novelist who makes lots of games about being poor and transgender, which are very gross and funny. If you haven't played them, they're all free on the internet, and you should play them. But a lot of them about things that don't exist and gaps, and how to make things that don't exist and gaps exist, even though they don't exist. So that's what that essay is about. How this games designer tries to work that contradiction out, and it's also about fascism and anti-fascism because I was proposing, this is something that Klaus Taylorite, excuse me if I mispronounce his name, says that one aspect of fascist personhood is this desire to have no orifices or gaps in yourself. You want to be a block. There's not going to be any holes. Nothing should be able to get inside of you, which seems, for anyone who spent some time on the internet looking at the way fascists talk to one another, it might be true. So I was just thinking about what it means to make art which is about trying to, first of all, create gaps in yourself as a represented character or personhood, and then to hold the gaps open. So yeah, maybe that's some background for
and
your starting point.
It's helpful. In relation to this question of law preserving or law creating violence. And
then maybe the land. I think it could. Sorry to why don't you talk about this? But the land art void stuff, maybe it would be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a artist that I hadn't come across. Danny had forwarded me her text, or their text, Elizabeth Niculo, on a journal called MoMA's Canadian Art and Architecture Journal, I guess, theory journal, who talked about her experience of going to see Michael Heiser's Double Negative in the desert, and how originally her main thoughts had been about kind of what it would be like to go to the desert and the kind of experience of seeing this. But then kind of increasingly she started seeing the analogy between land art as a kind of patriotic or sovereign practice by white male American artists in the 60s, and the kind of I guess composition, politics and dynamics of the NFT as both kind of burning and wasting the universe, the earth. So this idea of the production of voids as a kind of production of sovereignty or surplus in an aesthetic or financial register. And on the other side of that being like producing things for you not to look at or think about, which are kind of waste material. So obviously this dynamic can be seen as very, very general, this kind of on-stage, off-stage void and abundance. But so I was, just thinking about it. And in relation maybe to law preserving and law creating violence, I guess like with Benjamin's example, like the police are law preserving, and a kind of revolution would be law creating. But I guess I was, I didn't actually have time to make the link, and maybe people here have some thoughts about what the link between the void and the law preserving and law creating modes of violence could be. But I guess with law creating, there's obviously the sort of premise of a making void where something else can sort of be built in its stead, so kind of evacuation, or maybe what you were talking about recently with reference to destituting power or destituent power. So kind of subtraction, which needs to be accompanied the creation of a new polity or a new social arrangement, the law creating, and the law preserving. And I feel like both of those can be thought of kind of in terms of the void, because with the law preserving, there's like the kind of violent enforcement of the void of the social, which the state, or rather its kind of outsourced and not strictly legal agents fill up with violence or with management. So that's maybe some of what I was thinking in relation to what was it in relation to? I forgot. Actually,
computer game.
There was that, yeah.
And the land art.
Voids.
Voids.
Yeah, voids, and maybe
and the holding space is open.
Yeah.
And the holding space is open, and the production of void. Is it?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
it like an analogy?
Well, the holding of space is open would be almost in a way counter to the production of voids, because they're kind of voids for where kind of value can rush in.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like producing voids as the production of waste, which can be valorized. Yeah. Or the valorization process, which produces waste, whatever point in the process you want to look at it. And the kind of holding open of spaces would be maybe say, well, maybe we don't need to do that. we don't need NFTs. Or But that's kind of like taking the argument of that essay, that Elizabeth Nicolau essay, and thinking what could be the sort of, I mean, she doesn't sort of necessarily propose a counter which could be progressive or emancipatory to that production avoids. But I guess, yeah, she's interested in the kind of production of things and the circulation of things which don't need any of the aspects we've gotten used to associating with art in terms of like artistic value that is different from financial value, but like the total conflation of value in the NFT, and how like it doesn't have necessarily need authorship, it doesn't necessarily need these kind of mystified substantive forms. It's really just kind of pure burning of energy and exchange. So even like Adorno's art as absolute commodity is almost kind of more true of that than of, you know, more sort of conventional dimensions of art.
Yeah.
Maybe. But ask Danny about his poem. Because then it's kind of, yeah, because that was the last thing presented, it's kind of like the thing that we respond to, but we didn't get a chance to respond to.
But Danny, to link, I don't know if we need to link it, but I'm just kind of, yeah, do you want to talk about the spaces? Or the sites? Or the metal detectors, these kinds of...
Yeah, the thousand walk-through metal detectors.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about portals. Like the introduction of the poem is about that, right? The mythological idea of the test that you have to go through. You don't have to understand that in highfalutin terms. Actually, the main image of that in my mind. Has anyone seen Never-Ending Story? Yeah, there's a great portal scene in that. You can watch it on YouTube. It's a small child with a telescope watches a knight try to go through the portal, and the portal destroys the knight, and the child goes through. And because the child's soul is pure, it gets to go through. So this kind of idea of innocence and the ability to go through, which recurs in lots of Western popular culture, and has obvious mythological roots. And I'm totally suspicious of that idea, and I was thinking about the portals that in my life, when the lives of people important to me seem most psychically significant, and it's portals on borders, like walk-through metal detectors. There's some there are some courts in that poem, and in order to get into courts, most courts that I've been to, at any rate, you usually have to go through metal detectors to make sure you don't have a knife on you. They're connected with places of state authority and violence. So I was just obsessively working through that idea, which in the poems I write usually it happens through endless repetition of the same thing, slowly metamorphosing, mutating. It's the only kind of thinking I'm really able to do. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this the whole porpentine charity heartscape, anti-fascist gaps in yourself, ability to be penetrated, or to feel yourself as a non-subject or only a partial subject. The land art that Marina is talking about, which is just gigantic holes in the ground, dug up, the earth burn in order to power a new kind of stateless currency. I guess there is a connection there, right? Because the whole part of the romance of Bitcoin and then NFTs is the independence from the state. You don't have to be a political subject in the sense that you belong to a community anymore. It's just you and the code, and you're no longer dependent on a object which is representative of human collectivity. states in order to be able to carry out transactions and to be a subject in the economic world. So there is a sense that the subject of NFTs and Bitcoins is a subject without any gaps. Like, even to be dependent on the state or government is unbearable. But the flip side of that is the Kazakhstan being dug up and incinerated, and the slow increase in global temperatures, gigantic holes in the ground. So maybe like there's something there also about how you actually can't separate out fullness from gaps. The one is always dependent on the other. Like fullness here means gaps elsewhere. And in order to begin to approach one set of problems, you have to talk about the other as well. Sorry, that's not really a coherent answer to your question about the point. Maybe it's an attempt to escape from it.
I mean, we read a text. Well, kind of it was in the further reading. We didn't actually read it. In the last week with my students in Berlin, which was used the phrase about Web3, a universe of wallets. So it's like there's no subject, there's just wallets, because those are the only sort of entities that appear as addressable entities through the code in cryptocurrency or Ethereum exchanges. There's just wallets communicating with wallets. So that's the kind of monetization as sovereignty of the individual that maybe you're talking about. But of course the wallet is not gapless because it is often hacked into and emptied. Although the whole idea is that it is gapless, and that's what makes the whole thing precious.
But when is it hacked into and emptied?
All the time. By the sounds of it. I don't know. I don't have
Are there any other questions?
I think maybe I have one. Danny. I mean, also to me, because you both talk about these gaps, and you specifically talk about them within like oneself. But how they also like are linked then to this like destruction aspect of the material world. And I wanted to ask, since you work with poetry, how do you see this? How do you think it's like linguistic? How do you deal with it linguistically? Let's say it's like a very vague question. But I'm just interested in how you see this like in relation to language.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I mean, the reason why I really like the games of Porpentine and Charity Heartscape is that she is really good at this, and I don't really know how. It's that there isn't a formula that I understand. It's just you have to play the games. And for me, okay, so that in the like poetry community in that I come from, like there was in the last 10 years like lots of poems which were really long and really intense and like really fast. I don't know, maybe there's still the traces of that in my way of presenting stuff, but like when I started thinking about this question of like how do you put holes in things, or like how do you like create gaps or like load-bearing structures within language that allow voids to be maintained? I started to feel more and more anxious about this tendency within the like poetry culture that I came from or what I belong to. So I don't really have an answer. I'm still figuring it out, and I think that, or maybe I won't figure it out. But I wish I could. Yeah, I feel like it's exciting in some ways because it's a technical problem. Like you can talk about it in theoretical language. Oh yeah, artwork should have gaps in, but then what does that? That doesn't teach you to make artworks that aren't obelisks. Yeah, right, exactly. Completely full. You just got to like experiment.
I mean, they can be discursively full without being materially full.
No, that's true. I mean, I guess this is why I'm interested in. Yeah. well, he's like, you know, you're full of shit. That's that thing.
It's like a challenge.
Yeah, so the challenge is how not to be like a Bitcoin user. And there's no, or, you know, like a
how not to be a wall.
How not to be a sovereign subject, or like how to find ways.
Or a sovereign wallet.
Yeah, how not to be a wallet talking to wallets. And there isn't an answer, and I think like again in like all of this is connected to like damage and internal damage as well. Like how do you display the reality of like being a damaged person? That's a everyday vocabulary that we use to talk about ourselves, but like how actually to represent this without just collapsing again into a cliche about trauma is an unanswerable question in some way, or it can only be answered in practice. So I don't know. Like sometimes I think now that like if you're writing poetry and you want to answer that question, the task is to be a sort of collector of all the places where that does happen right, or in a way that feels exciting to you, and like, because that's not the norm. The norm is like people trying to present themselves as real people, full people, without gaps. Like here I am, I've written my poem, and I have some opinions which I can relate to you. The task is to try and find all the aberrant and non-homogeneous examples where it suddenly becomes possible not to be that. You can't tell in advance what that's going to be. Yeah, that's.
And the gas masks.
Yeah.
That's just maybe other people know. I was curious.
Gas masks. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, also like I finished that poem in March, and like the war was happening, and like, again, it's just like I guess the thing about writing long poems as opposed to writing a long novel is that you can allow everything to seep in from the outside, which means that you produce things which are incoherent, but they also contain surrounding reality. They're polluted by whatever happens to be happening. So yeah, I don't know. It's just hard to keep images of war out at the moment.
I have another question. It's about land art.
Okay.
No, it's just because I've recently been to this lecture where like land art was presented as like this revolutionary in art that sought actually to decommodify it, so to get out of this commodification. And then like it was really interesting to hear like how like you describe land art as like this construction of void, but then it's also like a commodity. So when you compare it to maybe Bitcoin, if we put them in the same place. So maybe I just want to hear your opinion about it.
Well, I felt like, you know, in lots of ways I'd never actually really thought about land art until I read this article. I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting conjunction that she's doing, or they're doing. And it's almost like she doesn't necessarily see land art as analogous to NFTs at the level of commodification, but kind of at the level of sort of art turning the world into waste. I think with land art, the relationship to commodification is pretty indirect. Obviously, you know, you can sell representation, and I mean the whole kind of land art can be like obviously put into the same constellation of lots of other conceptual art, except it operates on the landscape and it requires a lot of infrastructure. It requires a lot of energy and resources, also to go and see it, but not as much as to make it. I mean, obviously you can talk about it sidestepping the sort of traditional commodification of the art object, and that's very clear. And in that way, it's almost kind of the opposite of the NFT, where you don't actually even have an art object. You just have a trading of very unstable property claims. There isn't even commodification in a way. But both, I think the analogy is made in terms of this kind of art requiring this sort of making of wastes or making of voids. Or at least a kind of social form of art, even if you say, well, art NFTs don't actually have that much to do with art per se. So maybe it's kind of the valorization of something as art requires the kind of abjection of something else, whether it's land or energy or maybe other social instances that are recycled into it. So that's, I guess maybe that's also why you forwarded me that. I'm just going to keep throwing it back on you.
There's also maybe we should share it somehow. It's a really good short text. But it's also like this joke about what is monumental, right? Because she goes to the desert to look at this monumental piece of land art, and she's like, oh, it's a stupid little hole. It's like it's not even big, and then thinks about the actual scale of global mining, which is related to the artistic phenomenon of the NFT. So, that's billions of tons of ore being shifted all the time. It's like not a little hole in the ground. So the thing which is meant to represent the heroic subjectivity of the pioneer mid-20th century artist dominating nature, like Adorno says, turns out to be really puny, and the actual gigantic whole is something created by a social relation that no one individually has any control over.
Yeah.
Something other people trading NFTs.
Yeah.
Probably a better summary.
That's a good summary.
Yeah. Yeah, so in a sense, like the violence of form in art is not just about production. It can take other forms like excavation or extraction. It's kind of more about the relationship between the sovereign subject and what becomes material, which is also what can become waste.
I also found it interesting when you talked about like forensic aesthetics as law preserving. And is there anything else to say about that?
Probably, although I guess I haven't. It would help if I'd actually done more, like reading maybe of that book, rather than maybe just think about how forensic architecture projects tend to work. I mean, that's actually what's interesting about them, right? As well, is how they function as in the legal sphere, and that's where they want to function as well. But I guess, I was thinking insofar as they become instrumental or useful in legal processes, you could say they're upholding a law which has been junked by state violence or by the different processes. So it's like they're kind of pulling that law back out of the violence which has kind of overrun it, and saying, well, actually, we can restore or repair using the law. So it's kind of law helps to preserve something as well as this activity preserving the law. Law is kind of put in the service of a kind of institutional political process, I guess. But it's kind of on the side of using the law and thus preserving the law in that sense, you could say. So the law has to work in order for it to work as a kind of instrument of restitution or
like it has to set a precedent, and then that is followed.
Yeah, that in a way the law has to be like fished out of the rubble. And for that, both the rubble has to be reconstructed in a process, but also the law has to be reconstructed because it's in the road, I guess. And that's why it's preserving.
Okay. It's been long. But are there any final comments or questions? Anyone? Except otherwise, I would really like to thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, but there's so much to. It's been amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for
Yeah,
doing it.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.